people that aren't with us today. So, and I feel like we might have had a few people drop. It just takes them a long time. It takes the system a while to get that notification to me. So, if you don't want me to reach out to you and you are thinking about dropping, just reach out to me and just let me know. So I won't pester you. But okay, so today we'll have a quick Q&A on assignment 2. I know that there were some questions. I've answered a couple emails, so I want to make sure I'm clear. This is kind of a hard assignment because you go from being pretty, from having a lot of resources to what? I get to make all this stuff up? Okay. We'll talk about discussion boards 3 and 5, and then the 2 lectures, and we'll talk about assignment 3, which is just a general grant application. Just once again, I put it in every slideshow. Hit me up there. Not kidding, text me if you need to. That still stands. My boss texted me at 3 in the morning the other day. I have it, just so you know, like I have my phone on silent and the only people that can get through are like my mom or my husband. But we were set to go to Lufkin for a stewardship visit on Monday, and we were watching the weather, and I feel like she's very high strung, and so she probably was not sleeping anyway. But when I woke up and I saw 3:30 a.m. What? Okay. Anyway, so just so you know, you're not going to bother me. I get it when I get it. Just a reminder, y'all, class quickly comes to midterm and you're like, dang, it's here. So today, September 23rd, your donor profile draft is due. After going through some of the case statements, I cannot stress enough how helpful having someone else look over your work is in this class. And so I can definitely see the difference between those who have participated in some sort of feedback opportunity, whether it be directly in the Turnitin or not, and those who have not. So just know that. Do what you wish. You're an adult, but I highly recommend it. At the end of class today, we'll talk about that little C/F as corporate/foundation application. It's just a small grant application, and I'll walk you through it. And then note to self, classified discussion board open. So you can also see up here on the slides the next 2 classes and what's expected out of those. So Q&A on assignment 2. Here's your opportunity to ask any questions that you have about this assignment. Use that template that's there online. Profile board members. So there's a lot of sort of like thinking that you have to start putting things together, right? If I ask you to give me 5 years history of giving, then obviously that board member is a donor, right? Now, there was some questions about where you find contributions. That is not public information, okay? So the only donations that have to be reported by tax law are donations to public political institutions, right? So this is where you get to make up donor giving. And a lot of this assignment is not meant to be factually accurate because there is absolutely no way I can go really and check your work, right? So as you've now sort of started going through the motions of doing the assignment, if you're having problems and you really don't know where to start, I would choose somebody, maybe be a famous person, Matthew McConaughey, I don't know, George Bush, you know, maybe a local person that you know has given, you know, lots of money, and research, you know, Google their name, use those resources in that document I posted in the assignment folder to give you some ideas of where to look for information. But start there. It's actually really much easier to pick a normal person that you know and profile them. So, and go from there. So really the point of it is going through the motion of creating the donor profile, not ensuring that you have accurate information. Questions?
So this is a profile for like a top donor, correct? So if we were running a capital campaign, this is like the person who would give the most, like ideally, like this is, that's
It
who we're
can be.
profiling.
Those tend to be the types of profiles that we do. However, I would say think about it in terms of, so the midterm project is you will profile a donor and do a solicitation for them for the midterm project. So as you think through this assignment, think about doing that as well. So we're building up to being able to sit down with a donor and have a conversation and a solicitation with that donor. And so if you want to, I hate to kill two birds with one stone, but if you want less work, maybe work smarter, not harder, think about doing someone at an appropriate giving level associated with your organization.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Sorry, but just to clarify one
Yeah.
last thing, they can be a completely fictional person if we want them to be, right? They don't have to be based on a real celebrity or actual donor.
Nope.
Or can it be a mix? Like it's a real donor's name, but you're just guessing how much they give.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just looking for those key facts and figures that you can figure out where to place them, how to place them in that profile, right? I mean, the places that tend to trip people up the most are the donation, right? That 5 years worth of donations. I mean, it's as easy as putting, well, I put those samples in there for you, so y'all should be able to see it, right? Make it up, make up numbers. What would a great donor look like to you? So, you know, I've had students in the past say things like, well, they joined the board 3 years ago. Well, maybe they don't then have 5 years worth of giving. I wouldn't suggest that, but if you've thought through it and things match up, who am I to question? Because as I read those as a gift officer, knowing that you have presented them to me to say, this is a person I want you to qualify by having a visit with. And so if I feel like I have a good solid grasp on linkage, interest, and ability for the person, then it's a really good, well-rounded, well thought out donor profile. If it leads me to question, like, you can't, as some of the other places, that if you don't start connecting the dots, that it's your wealth indicators that are going to determine your capacity, which is that range of how much a donor can give over a set amount of time, and then link your ask into that capacity, then you're missing the point of the whole research project. So you can't only give me wealth indicators that would indicate a donor could give in the $1,000 to $10,000 range and then give me $100,000 ask. So you have to connect those dots, and you're going to have to go back into the textbook to get more information about how to make those connections. Yes, Rose. Linkage, interest, and ability is their connection to your organization. Well, I mean, their capacity isn't necessarily based on your organization. Their capacity is based on capacity and their wealth indicators, but their linkage and interest should be completely directed towards your organization. Like, as a gift officer, you can put other notes of maybe where they give some other big money. But, you know, for the most part, I don't really need to know, as a gift officer, every small detail of club or, you know, things like that they give to. But it's good to know. So Yeah, researchers, like you can easily go down rabbit holes looking for people and looking at people's information, especially like small town. But like the rabbit holes I go down when I look for donors in Lufkin is crazy and sort of like, yes, small town, big news. So, okay. If no other questions about assignment 2, then I am going to move on. Oh, and I forget, I have to. Okay, so discussion boards. I will say I really appreciated all the thought y'all put into the week 3 discussion boards. I lived up to my promise that everyone who did an initial post and did follow-up posts like you were supposed to got the full 8 points. I will say some folks, as I was going down the list and looking at posts, didn't hit those 2 responses in that middle time frame. So be aware if you think that was you. There was only a handful, or not even a handful, of folks that didn't quite get those check marks. But be more aware of it this time around than you were. So you should now be able to see the discussion board for week 5, and you probably cannot see the discussion board anymore for week 3. I took that down so it would not confuse people. So if you go on and you find, if you have any issues seeing a discussion board, please let me know. The next 2 weeks are going to be on pages 43 through 84, which is chapters 4 through 8. Post 1, it's that same time frame. Go in, make 1 post before the 26th. During post 2 session, you are going to go in and make 2 response posts to somebody else's post. And that 3rd post, you need to go in and respond to those who have placed a response on yours. So I'm not necessarily looking for the dates as much as I am for looking for the conversations happening. So if you find your responses happen outside those frames, but you are responding, you are active, you're putting good thought into what you're saying to each other, then do not, I won't hold you to these dates. But for those of you who need to be prompted to go in and do those types of posts, know that that's what I'm looking for from you. So once again, you can make a response to any of the main ideas in the assigned reading, but here are some thought questions if you're interested or need some prompts. So questions about week 5, it's going to work very similar to what we're used to or what you did in work in the last week.
So just to clarify, you're grading just the fact that we're responding and trying to have thoughtful discussion more so than the, I guess, grammatical structure and actual complete content of what we post. Is that correct?
Yeah, I do read them. I'll probably get a little more picky in the third round going on.
Okay.
So that'd be like week 7. Just looking for more than yes, I agree type of responses. Like, what do you agree with? So however, if it's the third thing down the list of a response back and forth, that's very different. But if all your responses to other people are, yes, I agree, I thought that same thing, period, and that's it, be mindful that you probably will not receive full credit.
Okay.
Yeah, and I don't really have, with discussion boards, I'll have to look. I think I might be able to private message you in the discussion board so not everyone can see, because I don't think it's appropriate to be like, oh, -1 for your thoughtful, thought out response. But no, I'm not going through looking for perfect sentence structure. get your thoughts across. Worry less about that and more about the critical thinking for that section. So, because I'm the first, like I have spelling mistakes all over the place. Like I'm the worst. So, which is probably why I see it the most in everybody else. But here's your discussion groups. I kept 3 people together that were in the same group and then just sort of switched out other 3. So it's nothing exciting, but if you log in and you find you don't see your discussion board, please let me know right away. It's just a matter of me changing restrictions that I clearly had messed up. So don't wait till, like, what is the 26th Sunday? Yeah, don't wait until the last minute. I guess it's Saturday, I might see it. But don't wait till the last minute to check. Go on there and check it out. So very good. So any other like housekeeping items before we move forward with corporate giving? Yikes. Gosh. Nothing. All right. Perfect. Okay, so corporate giving. Here we go. So as you probably realized reading through these chapters that the motivations, we've talked to this point, I should say, about motivations for individuals giving and how you look for, what their interests are and what their values are in much more of a personal way than is presented for corporate giving. It shouldn't be any surprise to you that there are very different motivations for giving for corporations than there are for individuals. There are some corporations out there that do believe, altruistically that giving back is just the right thing to do. But for the most part, corporate giving has developed into more of a what's in it for me, meaning the corporation, type of program or giving. And so I want to be very careful here that we make sure that you understand that there's a distinction in between sort of foundation, philanthropic funds, and what's typically a corporate sponsorship. And so sponsorships, as we think about them for corporations, are funds that typically come out of marketing dollars for the organization. And so marketing dollars from a corporation are typically called sponsorships. And there's something at the end of that sponsorship that has more to do with being seen than making a change. And so for those companies that are looking to, quote unquote, make a change, many of them have created their own internal foundation. And, some of the bigger corporations here in Houston, oil and gas, like Shell has their own foundation, Halliburton has their own foundation. And that's where you can really start to see the separation in between, here's how we're going to make global change or change to what we believe is important to us and our value system. And here's how we're going to spend our marketing dollars to be seen in the community. Yeah, Walmart does have a foundation. I think Target has a foundation. Many of them do, absolutely. And how those foundations get fed are from corporate profits. And then they sit in those foundations, and it's from the earnings that often you can see how much they're giving out every year. So motivations for giving for corporations. Some give because it creates a good environment for successful business to take place, right? When they're seen as being a good community partner, people are more likely to choose them as a business. Provide for social and economical well-being of citizens, kind of the same thing. If they look good in the community, then people want to do business with them. Sometimes it has to do with how the relationship benefits each party, more so the company. And there's also some corporations that have a desire to improve their local competitive environment for business. So if it's I mean, the best thing that we can relate to here in Houston is, of course, oil and gas. Like, look at what Chevron does versus Shell versus Exxon, right? They all have a competitive edge against another in one place or another. Okay, let me flip the screen and then go to chat. What do we got here? Sorry, guys. If I don't click on the right screen, it ends up. Yeah, the Waltons are kind of everywhere. Yeah. Okay. So current trends. It was probably in the 1980s that the corporations moved away from giving money just to give money to more of an integrated relationship with an organization. And we'll talk a little bit more about it with foundations, that unfortunately the trend became we as corporations want to influence change. And so many organizations, instead of looking for corporate money or foundation money that matches their mission, they try to reinvent what they're doing to fit into a bucket so they can ask or receive this money. And so it's an awful position, I think, that corporations and foundations have put organizations in, instead of accepting who they are as an organization and their mission and their purpose. They want to give to an arts organization, but they really want to do this with it. And I will say, it's not unheard of to create some programs to get funding from a corporation, but you really have to think that through, right? Because rarely are the programs that corporations want to invest in sustainable after that money goes away. So it's self-interested giving rather than the interest in the greater good. I mean, just always keep that in mind, that the corporation is coming to the table presenting themselves as a philanthropic partner, but they're really always wanting to know what's in it for me. Okay. So giving stats, smaller companies, when we start talking about corporate giving, I mean, that's a huge span, right? It's everywhere from some of the top companies, Forbes 500 companies, to those mom and pop shops that we know in our community really well. So when you start to think about smaller companies and smaller businesses, they tend to give a larger portion or a percentage of their income to the community. And so corporate profits have risen faster than their giving. I think the statistic was post-tax earnings, corporations are still only giving back into the community 0.8%. I mean, that's what we consider a really successful acquisition direct mail campaign, but like really 0.8%, come on, corporations, right? Because what they're doing is they're going to pay their shareholders first. And just keep in mind that in 2019, corporations gave 5%, according to US, Giving USA. I mean, $21.19 billion is a lot of money, but it's only 5% of the total pot. Once again, it is the lowest contributing group of the four. So individuals, foundations, corporations, and bequests. So dead people are giving more than corporations. Keep that in mind. So some of those changes in the 80s came about because of the multiple sort of economic downturn crises that we were going through and have gone through. I mean, I guess that was 40 years ago, right? Holy cow, mind blowing. And so what happened at that point was many corporations started to look about and focus their giving where their employees work. And so that's what is really defined by locally. If you look at places and the big gas companies, Halliburton has boots on the ground in many places throughout the US, and you'll see those states located on their areas of giving or regions for giving. So it's not unheard of that although the corporation may be located here in the state of Texas, that they're not giving in certain areas. I will also say that one of the big shifts for the Houston market was when Exxon and Anadarko moved up into the Woodlands, because then at that point they wanted to give back to that community because that's where their employees were living, and so they wanted to make that a better community for their employees, and they took a lot of that money that they had invested in Houston with them. And so one thing also to keep in mind is that more than a third of the philanthropic giving, which is not included in the donation USA Giving. So in-kind giving is not in those statistics that Giving USA puts out. But keep in mind that 1/3 of the philanthropic giving by corporations is typically in the form of in-kind donation or company product. So it's easier for them to give out mass productions of, I don't know, sunscreen, chapstick, things like that than it is for them to give out cash. So what do corporations support? Well, I mean, they support just as much as everything that individuals do, but they're really looking for programs and projects that can link them as a company to the nonprofit. But the thing to keep in mind is that ultimately they want to know that that link will benefit the company economically and socially, right? So people will think better thoughts about that company and buy their products. Ultimately, that's what it means. So how does a corporation support? Well, they do give in-kind products. They often will they have matching gift programs for their employees. So something to keep in mind is if you see someone, an individual come in and make a donation and they work at a large company, it might be worth your while to reach out and say, hey, do you qualify for a matching gift program? And sometimes you can receive up to double a one-to-one match for what that individual has donated from your organization. Many of the oil and gas companies do. I know CenterPoint Energy has one. They also do workplace giving campaigns. So they may offer an opportunity for nonprofits to come in and talk to their employees about giving back to the community and those opportunities. Here in Houston, that more so takes place as a driver that the Greater Houston Community Foundation really does for us here. So although corporations are a little more self-motivated for a self-reward when it comes to giving, we still have to pay attention to linkage, ability, and interest, right? They still have to be interested in your cause. It has to link back to what they believe in. And so how do you determine linkage, right? Does the corporation have employees that participate in your programs? You know, the easiest way to figure that out without having to have a conversation is look at your email lists, right? How many of your emails have an indicator that how many of them are work emails, right? Can you get a quick glance at how many are coming from certain corporations? That could give you an insight into, does this company have a lot of employees that enjoy the product that you have? And have they supported projects in the past? Is their corporate headquarters right down the street from where you are? Anything that you could look at as a link to your organization, consider it. The ability. Corporations do have profits, but what's the local economic climate for them? Probably oil and gas companies right now aren't giving a lot of money. But, things like waste management companies, they're doing pretty okay. In fact, their business is probably up considering all the people that have been home. Grocery stores, you know, gyms, places that we wouldn't have normally thought are doing pretty A-okay right now in this climate. So think about that. How does the current economic climate impact who you're going to and with what asks? Another place that you can look, are they supporting other nonprofits with gifts in the same range as your ask? If the corporation has an officially formed foundation, you should be able to pull up their 990 and right on there see who they're gifting their money to. So although individual gifts are not public information, they're private information, corporate foundations, if incorporated the correct way or in this way, you will see who they've given to and how much. So the cool thing is with corporations and foundations, you have a better sight line on the amounts that they can give. And one thing to keep in mind, unlike individuals, corporations and foundations, most of the time they have to give out money every year. It's not like they can reinvest it or keep it. Many of them have to give out a set amount each year based on the law. So it's not as risky to over ask a corporation. So interest, how do you gauge a corporation's interest in your company? Do they have a social or corporate responsibility page? And does it match what your organization's mission is? Have they come out and said, this is what we want to fund, here are the areas that we want to fund, and do you fit those areas? If not, don't waste a lot of time. Don't waste a lot of time trying to contact the organization to figure out if you fit into their giving structure. Maybe they've funded similar organizations. That's a key indicator. And do they prefer to fund projects, sponsor events, or give general operating support? All of this stuff is really good to know when you formulate your plan for the ask. Phil, to answer your question, are there typically times of the year where it's best to ask for a donation right before tax time? I actually have found that the best time to ask for donations is before they do their budgets for the following year, because they are typically budgeting, depending on their fiscal year. Most corporations have an August 1, September, October fiscal year start that you want to get to that corporation with your ask before they've determined the budget, because many of them are already giving out their funds or promising their funds prior as part of that budgeting cycle. So I would suggest there's bigger organizations that work a little bit differently, but I would suggest February, March timeframe is a better time period for corporations to start those conversations. All right, let's see. So we're going to talk about 4 different models for giving for corporations. We're going to talk about corporate productivity, the ethical or altruistic models for giving, the political, and the stakeholder. And what these models are meant to do is give you an idea of if you could put everybody you talk to at a corporation into a pot, this will help you figure out general strategies around solicitation and what may be more effective, and how to approach and talk about your project to be more effective and successful. So the first one, corporate productivity. So corporations that have this mindset, whether they realize it or not, their giving will help the community increase profits and return more value to the shareholder. So really what they're looking to do is, it will help the company increase profits. I think I said community. So ultimately, this is the epitome of what's in it for me. They want to know that if they give you money, how will it come back and somehow get people to buy more of their product, eat more at their restaurants. It's kind of like that marketing spin to it, because ultimately more profit means a bigger check to the shareholder at the end of the year, right? So here, if you're going to go to someone or a corporation with an ask that you believe fits into this bucket of corporate productivity, you have to demonstrate or message to them how it is going to increase their profits, right? If you are our sponsor of our major event, we can put a pamphlet or a flyer on each seat talking about what you do as a company. We'll give you the opportunity to make opening remarks or introduce the guest speaker, things like that. When you think about what can you give that company to get their name and their face in front of all your stakeholders and community shareholders. So a few other words that they talk about or refer to the corporate productivity is corporate citizenship, or sometimes I've heard strategic philanthropy. Now, I really don't like to use the word philanthropy here, because when you think about philanthropy, it's much more than just giving money, or at least at this point, you should realize that it's much more than just about giving money. However, corporations like to kind of muddy the water and make it sound better than it is. And so just be aware that if you see keywords like corporate citizenship or strategic philanthropy, that's a key that it's this model or this bucket that they fit into. So corporations that fit into this bucket are likely to give to organizations who can show how you can help them market their product or their business. Giving to your organization may improve internal employee morale. Like, it may make employees happy, and employees who are happy, in theory, work harder and are more productive. It could improve the public's image or perception of the company. And because of all of that, it could lower corporate costs. So, things to keep in mind. So if you have a corporation that you've identified here, a great fundraising strategy is to match your mission and activities with the company's desire for improved productivity. Sometimes this is a stretch. However, say you were going out to do community programs, taking your arts programs or educational programs into underserved communities. Well, maybe that corporation wants people to know who they are in that community, and they could sponsor that event and get their logo on it to start to familiarize who they are with that constituent group in that community. So there's a great example. And it's important to help message to that corporation how giving to your organization will help them improve their bottom line, right? Like, how will we help get people in your door at your organization? I think companies who do this very well, and I don't want to say that this is the only reason that these companies give, or this is the only model that they fit into, but HEB is really good at that. Like, HEB is really good at getting the word out about who they're supporting and why, right? So there are these really great donors and corporations out there that have this ethical or altruistic bucket of giving. And so these are the business leaders out there who really feel like they have a responsibility to be good corporate citizens. And you as an organization, in order to really match with an ethical or altruistic funder, you have to prove that giving to your program will ultimately alert those corporate leaders to community priorities. So who can you help them network with to understand the landscape of the community better, right? Because what they want to do is help use their good fortunes to help address what community needs are in the market that they operate. You'll have to appeal directly to the leadership of the corporation in order to do this. And you do have to engage, oftentimes you'll have to engage employees in the community in your efforts in order to bring that corporation further in. So think about volunteer opportunities. Like, where can that company's employees be good citizens? Like, sometimes corporations want their employees out there, but it's hard to ask an employee to go out and do these types of things on their own. But if they found a great community partner that they could match to, then they would send their employees directly there to do those community efforts on a set day. I'm trying to think of an organization. I think Deloitte does this every, like, around first week of June. Deloitte sends all their employees out for one big community day of service. And the types of things that they do are, school improvements. So they go in and they paint schools, clean up things. I think they've been known to do like Habitat for Humanity type work. But keeping that in mind when you think about this sort of funding activity or bucket for corporations. Strategies. So to be successful, or to be very successful at soliciting funds from this type of a corporation model, you have to be very aware and ready to talk to leadership about how these gifts will benefit the community by both their money, the engagement of their employees, and the engagement of their corporate leaders. So it's sort of like, you're not just getting money with this type of giver. You're getting their resources and their leadership. So is there a place for a corporate leader on your board with this company who believes in bringing this type of impact and support to your community? The third bucket, political. Corporations use this type of bucket. It's not just political in the sense of politics, right? This is more of a general use of the word political that's meant to say we're going to use our money to influence power or influence government change. And so typically in these types of giving programs, the organization serves as a liaison or the facilitator of that type of influence. And you have to be very careful, because sometimes there's organizations who present themselves as altruistic, but really have more of a political agenda at the end. So be very keenly aware of not being used by a major corporation just to get some money. Corporations that give through this philosophy want to build closer bonds between the nonprofit and the company. Why? Because you probably, as a nonprofit, are well respected in the community, and maybe they can leverage something off of that from you. But on the other side, maybe this substitutes for a government initiative. I think back to Hurricane Harvey and all the money that, oh my gosh, what's the big football player's name? I can see him. Everybody loves him. I'm gonna burn in. Thank you, JJ Watt. I was like, I'm gonna burn in hell because I don't remember him. But think about all of his efforts that he gave around Hurricane Harvey. And he didn't just give it to another foundation to give out. He didn't give it just directly to the American Red Cross. He went out there and he found the boots on the ground organizations here in this community, or I should say his mom did. She sort of runs this foundation, I think. That were doing things better and faster than the government can. I'm not saying he has a political agenda anyway, but that's an example of giving to an organization in lieu of a government initiative. So also sometimes people give to minimize government intervention. So if they give a lot of money to power up a certain type of organization, maybe that stops the government in some way or slows their progress. And, giving here, it can portray a corporation as a good public citizen. One of the really great stories I have around that is when I was working in DC, I had a really great friend who was working, a high school friend who actually was working for Anheuser-Busch at the time, but somehow was a liaison to the Koch brothers. And she reached out to me asking if my arts organization would want to accept a gift and really market that we received something from the Koch brothers, because they were looking to brush up their image. At least she was honest. Thank you. You want to use my name to make them look better. That's cool. Some other things that I think about that have happened over the years is when you think about like cigarette companies, how that has changed. We went from accepting gifts from Marlboro to now they changed their name and they're known as Altria, right? And so people don't recognize or actually put together what the product of Altria is, like they would if you came out and said, okay, Camel or Marlboro or all of that stuff. But we really had to think hard about whether or not we wanted to accept a gift from an organization that is so controversial to reaching out to children, right? And so you have to think about that. Like, is it okay to accept those types of donations when they present themselves? So corporations that give through this philosophy are most likely to support projects that build closer bonds between the nonprofit and the company. I feel like this is just redundant, right? Minimize intervention. We already talked about that. There we go. So strategies. To be successful at this model, you need to build alliances up and down the company. So not only with human resources, but marketing and research and public relations, because all of these individuals are going to want to have a piece in the puzzle, right? Not only internally are they going to tell their employees that they're giving to an organization such as yours, which you need the human resources aspect to, but marketing and public relations, they're going to want to know how, when, how much, when can they tell their story about how great they are. And they're probably going to want some research around who your constituencies are, right? Who do you have that they can reach, and who can they influence if they give to your organization? Another great example of this is when I was in Washington, D.C., we used to leverage relationships with the embassies up there. And so each of the embassies, not only do they have like an embassy headquarters, but the residents that these ambassadors lived at were phenomenal. And so we would often reach out each year and partner with a specific embassy. And one year we did China, and we brought in one of their rising stars. But in order to get a underwriter for it, they wanted us to promise that at the dinner that we had following opening night, that they were able to sit with the Chinese ambassador and have dinner because they wanted to do business in China. So there's a political sort of agenda behind it. It wasn't in bad faith for our organization. We probably would have done it for any major donor, like the underwriter for that event. But I mean, there's a less yucky example for you on political. So stakeholder, the final bucket for corporate giving. You have to keep in mind that the corporations are complex entities that have many stakeholders, much like a nonprofit organization, right? They have shareholders that they have to pay money to at the end of the year. They have their employees that they have to keep happy. They have to keep their suppliers happy and their companies happy, their customers, and any community groups around advocacy that maybe just don't like them, as well as government officials. So managing someone who wants to keep everybody happy all the time is best when you understand the interests of all those shareholders or stakeholders for the corporation, and understanding from a stakeholder corporation's point of view, who are the most important to keep happy, right? So if it's not important for them to keep government officials happy, then don't worry as much about them as it is to keep their shareholders and their employees happy. So corporations that give through this philosophy are likely to support projects that offer employees benefits or volunteer projects that maybe promote community education or environmental projects is anything that kind of goes back to giving the community and helping the community and help consumers of company products or services. So if they know who's buying their company product, they may want to support organizations in that community. So strategies here. You'll definitely want to identify which stakeholder groups are important and develop your project proposals in a way that would appeal to them. So if you know that they're really committed or maybe they're a top 100 company to work for based on employee feedback, then you're probably going to want to take them a way that employees can engage with your organization if they make a gift. Demonstrate how the organization is also a community stakeholder, but that stakeholdership, I guess, that relationship is really lifted or championed when this corporation gives back. So how can this corporation help you as a stakeholder do more of what you want to do? Questions or thoughts about how arts can relate to each of these models for giving?
In the political model, is there, I guess, an ethical issue with using donors or board members or people that your organization has contact with as leverage to get people, like to get them to donate to you?
Ask it in a different way. Like, I think I get it, but
as an organization, should there be an ethical concern about using the people who donate to your organization as I don't know how to describe what I'm saying. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Can you give an example?
Okay, so how you gave the example about them wanting to connect with the people from China, is that anything to raise an ethical concern by saying, oh, we have connections to these people that you want to talk to?
Now, I think that there are like ethical ways that you can manage it. I think what would be unethical would to be for the company to approach the organization and say, hey, how can you help us buddy up to China? Oh, well, let's throw this event to get you at the table. No, I mean, to me, that sort of raises some ethics of who are you in it like for? Like, is that really what your mission is serving? But for us, what I think made it more ethical, I mean, it's not unethical to do, but what made it okay was that we had already been talking to that embassy years in advance about what year we wanted to partner with them and who we were going to bring. It was a matter of that organization coming to the table and saying, well, we have this much money, is that enough, and can we sit at that table with them? So, I mean, it's a gray area, but I almost feel like when you cross it, and how it can become kind of dicey. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Thoughts? Any other thoughts? Okay. I see corporations have just fascinated you all this evening. Okay. Oh, wait. I forget, like, if I keep... Okay, so foundations. Foundations are much different, but not really. They're a little more honest and open about what they fund because of how they're incorporated and how they're established. And so foundations are really organizations with designated funds that are invested as if it's like an endowment, and every year it spits off investment income, and they have to distribute a certain percentage of that investment income every year. They do actually pay taxes on some of the investment income, but you can also pay penalties for not distributing enough money each year if you're a foundation. So keep in mind, it's probably more beneficial, but oftentimes harder work to get money out of a foundation. So 17% or 75.69 billion came from foundations in 2019. So that's more than 3 times what came from corporations. And I promise you, it is not as hard to figure out how to get money from foundations as it is corporations. So there are different types of foundations out there, and it's important to understand how they function and whether or not you can get money from them. So there are what we call independent foundations. This is what we would typically refer to as a foundation, a typical foundation that we would go to ask for funds. They're privately established. Their point is to provide support or distributions to tax-exempt organizations through grants. Most of these independently formed foundations cannot give money to individuals. There's a good ethical dilemma for you. It actually kind of, but there was a political figure who had a housekeeper whose daughter was uninsured and having a procedure done at our hospital, and reached out to the foundation to see if he could make a gift from his foundation to our foundation, and then we would use that money to pay for that person's healthcare costs. And so, number one, we don't do it. Number two, it's unethical because it's sort of a workaround of the laws, but there's a good ethical example for you, or unethical. So qualities of an independent foundation. Typically, their assets are established through gifts from individuals or families. They typically are named for the original funders. So these are the ones that you're going to see, like Houston Endowment, Brown Foundation, Cullen Foundation, the McGovern Foundation, are all fantastic examples of an independent foundation. They have to distribute a minimum of 5% of their endowment annually. And this is the largest type of family foundations. It represents 45% of all family foundations are independent, structured foundations. And typically these foundations specifically define their areas with which they fund. Many of them nowadays have official websites if they do accept outside applications. Many of the smaller or more startup foundations will probably not have websites or an understanding of how you can obtain funds from them. So there's corporate foundations. This is a subcategory of an independent foundation. It receives its assets not from an individual or a family, but from profits from a for-profit company. It typically serves, as we talked about in the last section, as the grant-making vehicle for the company. So this is the vehicle for change that corporations have created to make an impact on your community. And it's not any surprise that the interests of the giving typically mirrors the corporation's business interests. So oil and gas companies like to give to engineering schools because why? It's a feeder directly into their corporation and in their employment pool. So there's a great example right there. And giving is often directly influenced by employee involvement or location of employees. Examples here, Wells Fargo Foundation, Bank of America Foundation are both examples of corporate foundations, if you're interested in learning more. So the community foundation is a very unique model, and you will often only find community foundations in larger cities. What a community foundation is a pool of assets from a large number of donors, where each individual donor gets to determine what they fund in this pool of resources. So we talked a little bit about these when we briefly covered donor advised funds. Donor advised funds are types of funds that are often invested or managed by community foundations. And I guess it would be sort of like a community foundation to a small family foundation is like a accountant to an individual who wants to have their taxes done. So to a donor, that's the type of service that the community foundation can manage for them on a higher level. And of course, here, these foundations or these pools of large sums of money or moderate sums of money are exempt from that 5% minimum annual distribution requirement. Why? Because they typically are not they are not officially formed as a foundation. It's a pool of assets that the community foundation manages for them as if it were a foundation. So we do have one community foundation here in Houston, and it's the Greater Houston Community Foundation. They actually have a lot of resources. So if you're interested or looking for stuff, don't shy away from them. Rose's question, can a foundation be when employees donate part of a check toward a corporate initiative? I guess it depends on the corporation. I would guess what might happen. Go ahead. It sounds more like what you're talking about would be more like an employee giving campaign where the corporation has selected an organization and or a corporate initiative, and now they're going internally and asking all of their stakeholders or their employees to give. A great example of this, United Way campaign.
Well, so what I had in mind, because I didn't know if this was a foundation because it's part of a corporation, but restaurants, what they do, for instance, Darden, they did something called Darden Dimes, to where you just round up on your paycheck. Like if you were like 20 cents, you round up to the next dollar and put it in a pool of money. And whenever an employee is in need, no matter what hierarchy, they can apply for Darden Dimes and get a grant of like $1,000. So is that a foundation or?
No.
No?
No. And so what I can speak to is how it's managed at a nonprofit organization. And so at larger corporations, I mean, I even think like I have a little insight to how the government works, and they all it all works a little bit differently because there are tax laws that prevent certain things from happening or that apply in certain ways of giving and not. So for instance, when Hurricane Harvey hit, and we did a really big national campaign with all the 50,000 employees that exist in my organization. Those who gave to support the fund, basically give back to employees that were in need. It was a tax-deductible donation. It was collected by us, the foundation. But when it was distributed, because it was considered a national emergency, it wasn't taxable to the employee who received it. I can't imagine that if you as an employee in a corporation, if you gave out of your paycheck to an employee fund, that it could be tax deductible, because the corporation has no weight. It doesn't have the IRS designation to actually accept charitable contribution. So it would just have to probably be a good faith effort of giving back to your fellow employees versus being a tax deductible donation. because they wouldn't be able to put it into, I mean, it would go into a fund, absolutely, but would it go into a foundation? I guess it could if the corporation had one, but most of the time, employees donate more so like hours back of vacation for other employees I've seen. But I will say it, those types of giving programs are really tricky. And I'm not sure, for a nonprofit organization, you can absolutely make a donation to any fund that your nonprofit has, and it would be tax deductible. But for a for-profit entity that doesn't have a 501c3 designation or a non-exempt designation from the IRS, you wouldn't get a tax deductible donation for that, like a receipt. So I hope that helps answer your questions, or maybe I just muddied the water. Okay, so now there are these very small type of foundations that are incorporated as operating foundations. And these foundations are dedicated to conducting research and promoting programs related to the original charter of the organization. So they typically, if ever, fund other nonprofits. They typically fund their nonprofit that they exist to support. And so the IRS mandates that they spend 85% of the income to support their own programs if they are in fact incorporated this way. I don't have a lot of experience with these types of foundations, but an example here would be the Texas Heritage Society. They're an operating, established foundation, and they in fact fund their own research, so, and operations out of that pool. So some trends that have existed or emerged over the years about foundation giving is they're really becoming more key. I just feel like it's not a trend anymore, but in the evaluation process, be ready as an organization to be accountable for your metrics, how you spend the money. Hopefully gone are the days where you actually have to give them a cashed check showing that you wrote it to the person that you wrote it to. However, Houston Arts Alliance was still doing that, requiring you to turn in check stubs for expenses as part of the evaluation process. And spending their money wisely, as you said, really does affect whether or not they'll renew your grant or give you money in future years. They really want to understand how their money has influenced your programs and maybe their agenda items, right? What did they hope to accomplish? What is their mission statement as an organization? You know, it takes, sort of looking here, I mean, really, as part of the evaluation process, most of them are going to want to know measurable results as part of the application process as well as the evaluation process. Sorry, just reading the chat to make sure I didn't miss any questions. So collaborations. Foundations are really pushing organizations to not duplicate services or replicate services that other organizations do, but how can they form a coalition? How can they collaborate together to have a more stronger front and serve the population, right? So if foundations can give in one place rather than two and have a bigger impact, they're probably going to suggest some collaboration. There has been a lot of professionalism in the application process. So for people who wrote grants in the 80s and early 90s, man, there was just a lot of junk that was included in it. And it was almost as if it was an unfair advantage that I sat on a grant panel probably in the early 2000s in the state of Florida. And it was still back then when you had to complete massive 3-ring binders with all of the things you can think of. Like these things were 4 or 5 inches thick. And if you think about, I wasn't even sitting in the state of Florida, physically sitting there. I was I, gosh, I can't even remember where I was. But they mailed me a box of 3-ring binders that I had to review. And all I kept looking through these and thinking was the resources that monstrous organizations had, just small organizations that didn't have flashy print collateral. They didn't have brochures. They didn't have posters. They didn't have CDs that they could share, or back then VHS. That that grant funders or reviewers could look at to get to know their organizations. Well, because of the impact or the change that the internet has had on the application process has been so profound, right? It's now less about those flashy pictures, and it's now absolutely more about how you answer the questions, right? You're forced to say what you have to say in a minimum amount of words. And so many of them have professionalized their application process. It's the same for everybody. They have stated deadlines when their boards meet. We'll talk a little bit about that after the trends section. But many of them have clearly defined their interests. No longer are they just accepting proposals from everybody. They want accountability from organizations, that they have functioning staff, effective board governance, and that there's long-term fiscal plans in place that are sustainable for organizations. And that the mission of the organization that they give to relates to the social needs and concerns of the foundation. So they've become much more narrow in their focus to give. So when you find a good partner in a foundation, you'll nurture that relationship more so than you would for any corporation out there. There has been an emphasis on board diversity, that while foundations are really pushing for, and they can, right? Because they control the funds. And so they have the leverage to place an expectation on nonprofit organizations doing business in their funding areas that their boards look like the constituents that they serve. And I will say it hasn't quite impacted change as much as one would hope. Boards are still primarily white male, but it's not unusual to ask about recruiting efforts and how you're putting diversity on your board and what that means to your board and your organization. And you will also say that boards and staff of foundations are also becoming more diverse. When I moved here to Texas, 10 years ago, the Houston Foundation, all of their program officers, 90% of their board, and their leadership staff were all white. And now the diversity is amazing. So they saw it, and they knew that if they were requesting their organizations to take a look and make a change, that they themselves needed to make a change too. So types of support that foundations give. If you find a foundation that'll give you operational support that's just strictly unrestricted, you hold on to them, you take them to lunch, you treat them like they're your best friend, but they're not really your friend. Really steward them well. You can get program support, which is probably the most likely, is that the foundation is going to want to attach itself to a specific program that your organization does. You may find foundations that'll give to capital or only capital. If you find foundations that will give to pilot or startup or planning for those types of purposes, keep them in your back of the mind if you're not doing that right now. If you come across them, because there's very few organizations that will invest in you starting up a program or doing a feasibility study to determine if you can do a capital campaign. And then some foundations like to do challenge or matching grants. That's how they structure their giving, meaning we'll give you $1 million if you raise $10, or we'll match up to the first $1 million of unique support that you raise during this type of period. So those are examples right there. So now that we've talked about the types of funding and what you can expect out of a foundation, let's really talk about how one goes about preparing and writing a grant for a foundation / corporation. So you need clearly established organizational goals and priorities. This is not a new concept. I feel like we talk about it in every section. That means your case statement, brush it up. What's it look like? Is it relevant? You need to diversify your financial resources. Foundations don't want to know that they are the only place that you're going to for support. Because how does that look for sustainability? What if they can't give to you next year, right? Will they want to give to you this year? And if they don't give to you next year, will your doors close? You aren't going to want to do regular research as if they were an individual. You got to find out the linkage, ability, and interest in your organization. And building a trusting relationship with a grant person, representative, it takes time and it takes effort. But I will find of all the people in between individuals, corporations, and foundations, that gift officers, program officers at a foundation are the most lovely people to talk to. Because why? Because they have to give out money every year, right? And they're looking for awesome projects that help them fulfill their mission in the community. So reach out to them. More often than not, you're going to get some sort of response. So one thing to keep in mind as you start to identify opportunities for funding with foundations, you really have to take yourself through this assessment and ask these questions before you should apply for any grant, right? So with this application and this funding opportunity in front of you, does it align to your mission? Number one. If it doesn't, don't do it, right? You get that mission drift. It's where you start to chase funding. But how does receiving that grant or applying for programmatic support fit your mission? Does the project you want to take the funder fit what the funder wants to fund? That's an important thing. Don't waste your time. Grants are comprehensive and they take a lot of time. Is the deadline realistic? Do you have 4 months to write this, or do you have 4 days, right? If you can't reach the goal after understanding what the application is like, then you got to set it aside, right? Maybe come back to it next year. Will you be competitive? This is much more of a question that I ask when federal or state grants become available, right? So human trafficking is a huge initiative, but when we see funding coming down from a federal level, where there's only 2 grants for $400,000 a piece, is it worth our time? Based on how big our organization is, because I will tell you, government grants are no joke. And then leadership. Do you have the engagement of your leadership? Will they help you spend the money if you go after this foundation, right? Or is this sort of a wish and a dream type of project, and you're going to go chase down these funds, and your leadership is going to, at the last minute, pull the rug out from underneath you and say, oh, I'm not really doing that program next year. So these are all things to keep in mind. And if you can check those boxes for all 5 of them, then yes, give it a shot. Go after that application. But make sure that applying for this new grant doesn't take precedent over other fundraising activities. It's like above and beyond, right? You can't sacrifice money that you need to come in and that's more reliable to you to apply for something new. And so when you think about how much time it takes, think of these in 3 equal buckets, that you're going to spend as much time planning as developing as completing and finishing. And so the two start and stop place are the first thing on the planning and the last thing on the completing. But under planning, that's when you get leadership approval. Start from the top down. Should you even be looking into this? If you get a green light, then assemble your grant team. Who needs to help you? Who needs to be on the team? Writing a grant by yourself is ridiculous. Who else can proofread it for you, right? Who else can make sure that you're answering that question that the grant is asking you? How do you engage stakeholders, right? Can your board help you? Can any other major donors help you when it comes to planning out or making introductions to a foundation? Do your research, right? All these questions. This is the research aspect. And in that planning phase, Lord help you develop the budget here, because it's the organizations that I've worked with that have waited to develop the budget in the developing and completing phase that have really big challenges meeting deadlines for grant submissions. So that middle bucket, the developing phase, this is where you define your program. If you don't already know what it is, you write the grant, you review and edit it, you revise it, you have to format it. Typically, you're submitting it online, but you don't have the opportunity to print out copies, right? So you're going to work from a Word document and then copy and paste. And you're going to want to make sure you have enough time to put it in there and review it and make sure before you hit that submit button that the formatting is great, and that you have everything you need. And then, it doesn't end with just putting it into the grant module online and reviewing it. The completing steps, like there's always supplemental documents. Many organizations ask for proof of your nonprofit status, a board listing, financial statements, any kind of programmatic documents, or like if it's for an event, do you have a listing of what do they call it? Things they get back. If you give at a certain level, what do you get? Those types of things. And then you put it all together and then you submit it. So make sure that when you think about allocating your time, and if you have the time and the resources to do it, make sure that you leave adequate amount of time for that completing or finishing it properly. And then my rule of thumb is it always takes about twice as long as you think it's going to take to do a grant, and aim for turning it in a week early. And if you can do that, you will almost always meet deadlines, because you have to remember that what's important to you as a development officer is not top of mind to your executive director. Getting something in front of them at the last minute is never a good plan, and it never works out well. So keep that in mind when you think about the timeline. So when you go to make a request with an organization, you may come across foundations requiring what they call an LOI, which is a letter of inquiry. And what this is kind of like a cover letter that, is like 1 to 2 pages long that really introduces the organization to your programs and projects, and what you're hoping to accomplish with their help. I wouldn't include budget numbers in this unless it was specifically requested by the organization. Really focus on the project. Typically, I wouldn't include in here a specific ask, how much we're seeking from the organization or the foundation. I really focus on talking about how the program we're going to present them, the funding opportunity that we want to present them matches their mission. And how it's a win-win for everybody. So it's almost like a mini case statement written directly for a foundation. You also may see something about a letter of interest, which is a brief description of what the organization plans to do with the funds. The letter of inquiry is a little more philosophical, talking about overall picture, making a case to submit an application. And a letter of interest is more, is shorter, hence the brief description, And it often does include the amount of funds you're seeking from the organization. So be prepared when making a request to even have to do this first step before you even get to the application. And so if you are invited to submit a proposal, these are all the typical things that you may see in an application. So first and foremost, most likely you're going to want a cover letter from either your board chair or your CEO. There'll be a cover sheet or an opportunity for you to put in not only organizational contact information, but a contact information for a gift officer or someone who can answer specific questions about the grant or the request. An executive summary, what's it about? What do you hope to accomplish? What's the need? All these types of things you'll have to answer in some shape or form within the grant. And so governance and staffing, governance means board, and who are the key staffing individuals who will play a role in that, and the budget, and often a budget narrative or explanation. So what does that consultant fee actually cover? So these are all typical things. So once you submit your grant application, it's back in the old days, they would stamp it. Like Mary at the front would put a big old receipt stamp and write the date on it. Now things are time stamped, right? They have the ability to close portals or close applications after the deadline. So it's imperative that you never miss a deadline. And so typically your application is reviewed for completion. If you're lucky and you didn't include something and they're a really nice organization and you've built a really great relationship, they'll call you and let you know your grant application is incomplete and that you have maybe like 2 hours to get it to them. And you, of course, drop everything and do it. And if not, you may just get rejected. So if your proposal or your request makes it to the next step, you may be contacted for an interview or site visit. The foundation may want to come visit where you're located and the programs that you do, or they may just want to have a conversation with an executive director or an artistic director to ask more about the programs. You as the gift officer should be in on those conversations to help guide your executive director and answer questions when they have challenges. You may have to attend a panel. I had to do a panel like this for state grants in the state of Florida, where you're kind of in the hot seat in front of everybody and they ask you just ridiculous questions, trying to play gotcha, but it may happen. So be prepared. And you may be asked to revise your original proposal. That's not a bad thing. Maybe they saw a glimmer of hope of something more specific that they wanted to fund. Say yes and go with it. But be very clear on what their expectations are around the revision and when they need it back by. So then comes the grant decision. Oftentimes with foundations, there are boards, and it is the board that determines how their funds happen. It typically at a board meeting. So it's important to know when you'll hear back from the organization or when you can plan to receive the great news. But some of the things to keep in mind is, you got to act professional, right? Regardless of the decision, you got to thank the grant officer. You got to keep in touch with them. Typically, they'll offer you advice on why your project didn't get funded. And maybe they can give you tips for next year. The worst is when you hear back, oh, you know what? You had a fantastic grant. It met our requirements. It was exactly what we typically fund. We just didn't fund you. Better luck next year, right? Because you're kind of like, I don't know what to do now. So build that relationship with that grant officer at the foundation and find out. Be prepared to offer updates. So if you in fact receive a grant, it is not abnormal to have quarterly or interim reports. So if it's a multi-year grant, they may want an update every year before they release funds for the following year. making sure you're spending the money as you express to them that you would. Final reports these days are usually required. So be sure that you understand when that is due. Don't miss a deadline. And be a good steward of the foundation's report or support. You know, spend the money where you said you would spend it. And turn in that stewardship report when it's due. Because it's really hard to have a good relationship with a foundation when you have stewardship issues, when you haven't turned in grant reports, when you haven't spent their money. You can't go back to them with another ask. So keep that in mind. If you want to look at an example of a great foundation that pretty much funds almost all arts organizations, so here a little tidbit if you're seeking money. The Hammond Foundation is pretty fantastic with spreading the love throughout the community. Questions before we talk about assignment 3? It's really, before we go into the assignment, kind of wraps up what we're going to lecture on today. All right. I feel the dreary wearies is happening in our house too. My children have been home for 3 days. Sure. Katie, ask your question about the capital campaign lecture. Intrigue those 8 people who have not watched it to really want to watch it.
In your capital campaign lecture, between the part of the process that is quietly collecting money before you go public, in your lecture, you said to try to go public when you have 85 to 90% of your goal met. And in the textbook, they said to go public at 65% of your goal, because if you wait too long, the public will think that they don't need to prioritize your ask because you're so close to your goal already. And I was just wondering where that difference in opinion comes from.
So, number one, I think the textbook is a little old, right? So I think now we're talking, 3 years now. And so there is a little bit of that. You know, there are organizations who feel comfortable going into the public phase at 60%. Museum of Fine Arts, right? When you feel like you have reached the point where you're out of those lead or major asks and you have a significant amount raised, it's probably okay to go public. But it's really, I feel more comfortable going at 80 to 90% because it's not like you're going to say, I only need $10 more to meet my goal, and then no one gives you, right? So you don't really announce where you are in the campaign when you go public. Typically what you do, and you know, the 5 Minutes for Fundraising book really talked about this, is that you leverage the generosity of your largest donors to find more donors, right? So when is that timing right? It kind of takes a team to talk about it and understand when that timing is. And things are constantly changing. So as with the capital campaign, we're getting ready to launch up in Lufkin. It's about a $6.5 million campaign. It has not been approved by the board yet. And so the timeline is in the next 3 weeks, like we have funders lined up, we have the asks ready to go, but we cannot go until someone signs like the paper and says, yes, you can do this program. Now, we probably won't go public with that until we have exhausted anyone who can give $250,000 and above. And that may take us a year. Because if you think about the philosophy of going from the top down, it's a strategic dance, right? You don't want to go to the next person until the person who can give, who has a greater capacity, has the ability to make their mark. And so we probably, based on our prospects for that campaign, will not go public until about 80%. Now, I will step back and say that the community will be very much aware that this program is coming to the community. So there's sort of this marketing buzz that will happen, but they will have no idea that there is a philanthropic campaign like around it to bring it to their community. So yeah, I hope that answers your question. There is discretion. I think it's go when you feel confident that you can roll in everything else. I know like I said, the Museum of Fine Arts, I think when they were building their new contemporary art, they went public at 60%. And I was like, y'all crazy. And so, but they knew that their public phase was going to be another 3 years. So, I'm just more of I want everything wrapped up. And so I know it's a sure thing, because what if you don't reach your goal, right? Like, and how far from it will you be? So, I mean, it's a song and dance. It's different with every campaign. It's different based on your feasibility studies and what you can get out of your organization. So, and your prospects.
So to clarify, if you have this large goal and you raise the 80%, you go public at 80, or even 70%, you go public at 70%. Do you tell the public that you're only trying to raise that 30%? Like, do you say, or do you just not give a number and just say we're fundraising for this thing?
That's what I would do. I mean, if you gave a number, I would give your total number. So for me, I would say if I had raised, I don't know, 5.2 million, I had like 1 million to go, I would come out and say we're raising 6.5 million. We have a $6.5 million campaign. And then you would strategically drop in the community, in the buzz, oh, your lead gift gets announced first, right? So think about it in terms of if any of you have watched over the years, University of Houston did their first massive comprehensive campaign. There was a silent phase to that where they lined up those donors. And then it was in that public phase that they started announcing those donors. So some of those donors had committed their gifts 2 to 3 years before they went public and started announcing it. So how can you use those gifts to leverage more gifts and more supports? So yeah, it's all about knowing the players and knowing the game. Like if you like puzzles and you like strategy and trying to figure out what's the best play, like fundraising is fun that way when it comes to campaigns. But they're also a lot of hard work because things are constantly changing. Sometimes your sure fit donors don't come through for you. But there's always a really great map, whether or not it's what you thought it was in the beginning, is another story. So, but yeah, campaigns are fun.
And so sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I have 2 questions that are completely unrelated with each other and with what we've talked about already. But in the trends of these foundations and foundational giving, especially with evaluations, something that I've kind of discovered through the performing arts, I'm not sure about museums, but performing arts always struggle to evaluate programs, because a lot of the times it'll be, we took a family show to a community library, there was 100 people, we hit these vocabulary words, but we can't tell you if anybody took anything home. Is there any, I don't know, like combining of the minds of like how best to tackle these evaluations for these foundational stewardships, if you will, reports?
Yeah, so one of the things that I would suggest as, and I would say a best practice now, and a core competency in creating programs for an organization is understanding how you're going to evaluate it as you go into it, right? And so what does success mean? Like, what is your organization hoping to accomplish with that program? Is it just to be in X amount of underserved communities? Is it to be in front of X amount of people in certain age groups? So understanding what the impact will be will help you understand how to measure it. Because I will say for nonprofit arts and cultural organizations, coming up with metrics is probably the hardest thing in the world, because gone are the days that we can just show up and say 800 people came to our concerts. Because now they want to know, well, what do you know about those 800 people, right? Well, what does your ticket price say about those 800 people? Okay, well, what are you doing if the arts are so important? Why don't you want to take them to the people who can't pay for those tickets? Those types of questions are coming out, and those discussions are being had. So understanding what your goals are before you launch the program and how you measure it will make you more successful. I mean, unfortunately, I don't have like the magic wand of saying this is what people have measured, because it's hard to take, because we all know that the arts have a long lasting impact. And it actually took, when we talk about drawing conclusions of being artistic and having access to the arts and how it shapes your mind and how you problem solve. When you sit amongst artists, you don't realize how creative you are at problem solving. And then you sit among hospitalists and you're like, wait a minute, like, can't you just do this? And they look at you dumbfounded because your brain just works in a different way. Like, there's something to be said about it, but how do you measure it? Right? The only thing that, someday, somewhere, someone will have done a research project on following individuals who have had the impact of arts at a young age throughout their lives and where they end up, right? There's no doubt in my mind that there's a reason why, I don't know, 80% of major physicians out there today have had some sort of musical influence, whether they played an instrument or sang in a choir. I mean, there's creativity, there's matches there. Okay, question from Caitlin. Are community satisfaction surveys a good way to measure impact? Her museum and the Cultural Center in Austin always hand out surveys at the end of the programs. You know what I think? I think those types of surveys, it depends on the questions, right? They could be demographic capturing surveys, or they can be something that's just required as part of receiving funding. So I think Houston Arts Alliance, it may still be in their grant application. I haven't perused them lately. They have required in the past an annual audience survey from their grantees. But I'm not sure. I had to take, 20 years ago, I had to take I can't even remember the class in grad school, but it was about surveys and measuring and doing research. And there are different types of measurements, right? So there are the measurements that are more opinion driven, and then there are like factual things that you measure. So when I think about a community satisfaction survey, I think that measures more of a person's perception of your organization rather than your impact. However, if you ask for demographic information, it could measure the amount of impact you're having in specific communities. So it depends on the question. A marketing plan for HAA. Good point, CC. So CC chimes in with HAA doesn't ask for surveys for last year or this year, but they do expect a marketing plan. So HAA is notorious for changing things and not telling the community. So if you're looking for grants from them, stay on top of it. All right. It's so true. So many organizations got hosed when they revamped their grant programs and like didn't tell anybody.
Well, this year they cut the grant in half by 50% because of hot taxes. So we're only getting half of what we were contracted.
Was it already granted to you too? And now you're, yeah. Damn. That sucks.
Yeah.
And it's happened in the past, is that they grant out based on an estimate of what they believe they will bring in from hotel and occupancy taxes. But when you have a pandemic and no one's traveling, you don't have any taxes to collect.
Yep.
So
A lot of the artists who are granted it have been kind of organizing a little to figure out how to address it, both to see if there's ways of getting it for people who have been funded or to make sure some of the funding structure changes.
yeah, I think in the 4 years that I worked there, at least 3 of the 4, we had to go back to at least one granting group and tell them they weren't really getting as much as we told them they were.
Yeah.
Which is kind of fiscally irresponsible of HAA, but you know.
And especially in the year, like they announced it kind of around the time when the police department was getting an extra 19 million. And then they've said they've gotten a number of restricted funded things like CASE, which is federally funded, and then they've gotten like the community fund to help artists. And then they had the airport projects. So they're like, we've made it up. Like we found 6 million for artists. It just can't go to the contracts that are already in place.
That we already promised. Yeah. I mean, that's not abnormal. It's not abnormal when you work with state and local governments for funding and it's based off of taxes or those types of things. But I will say, you know, Houston is still one of the only cities that I know of that actually give general operating support out to their organizations that reside in their city. Which, if you ever wondered why 99.9% of the arts organizations are located inside of Houston proper, is because that's where they can receive funding. If they're located outside of Houston, the funding is not as great. So, anywho, so assignment 3. I promise this is not going to be as painful or as daunting as it perhaps may sound. But your assignment 3 is to take your case statement, which I promise to get through in good time. You're going to write a grant application or a grant proposal based on that assignment. So you're going to take your same organization, your same purposes, go through, look at that case statement and the comments that I've put in there, and make them reflective in your writing. But basically what you're looking at is there's no length requirement unless otherwise noted in the application. And please, in sections 3 and 4, double space it for me. So in Turnitin, I can write notes without covering up things. It's just for me, not for you. So you get assigned today. Your draft is optional by September 30th. And then your final is due 2 weeks from tonight. So section 1 and section 2, y'all should receive full points for both these sections. So section 1, you're going to fill out the organization's legal name. Are they doing business as something else? You know, I worked for an organization in Florida that was legally named the Big Bend Community Orchestra, but they were doing business as the Artist Series. So there's an instance there. The address, city, state, and postal code, telephone, and a website for the organization. Look that stuff up. See if you can find it for your organization. If not, make it up, or you'll lose points. Section 2, this is the primary contact for the grant. So this is going to be you, right? Your first name, your last name, your title. What would your title be if you were at that organization? Coordinator, director of development, I don't care. An address for you. Are you working from home? Maybe that should be your home address. I'm not going to know. I'm not going to look it up. The best contact number for you and your best email address, right? Where can they reach you if they have questions about the grant? So those are gimme points. Section 3 of 4. You know, it gets a little bit harder. You're going to have to find the date your organization was established, the name of your executive director, any board members. So you're going to want to list their names and affiliations. You're just going to do this in a Word document. In fact, you can take, I'll double check that I put it up there as a Word document so you can save it and not have to reinvent the wheel. The assignment category anyway. Put your mission statement. For an application like this, you do not have to cite the website, okay? But I will say, don't copy and paste things from the website because it will come up and it will not be your work. So still you're gonna paraphrase. The mission statement is the one exception. You're gonna provide a brief summary of relevant information for the grant funder to know about your organization. What's important? You don't have to use all 1,500 characters. So it's not words, it's characters. That means spaces and periods as well. You're going to briefly describe your current programs. This may be redundant and repeated in the next section if you are asking for general operating support from the organization. So brief description. Don't go into a lot of detail here. Keep it high level, sort of that 30,000 foot understanding. And that's assignment section 3. So the section 3 is really about the organization. Let me check my chat for questions. No, okay, so Caitlin, it's not necessary to include an advisory board in this unless you think that a member of the advisory board would be influential to the grant panel. Katie, I'm not understanding your question. What should be included in affiliations?
Names and affiliations
Oh,
of current
okay.
board members.
Sorry. So their names and then comma, where do they work? If they do not have a job, sometimes we put philanthropist is a nice name for someone who just likes to support organizations. Perfect. Sorry that I was not following. So once again, section 3 is about your organization. When you get to section 4, this is about your project, right? You're going to name it. What's the project title? Come up with something fancy. Doesn't have to be. Item number 2, how much money are you asking for? Don't put a range, put an exact amount. You're welcome that you don't have to do a budget to back this up. This is all narrative this time. You're going to talk about what the overview of the unmet need is, right? What's your problem statement? This is where we talk about revising that case statement for another format, right? And then in number 4, you're going to talk specifically about the program or project that you're asking for that money, right? So number 2, the amount you're asking for is going to be, you're going to describe the project in number 4, right? Talk about the goals, major components, and how it plans to address the unmet need that you already talked about in number 3, right? Don't waste your time in number 4 or your characters talking about the unmet need. Do all of that in number 3. So number 5 is where you're going to talk about your metrics, right? What are the outcomes? What are your goals? How will you know when you get there? So talk about that and how it benefits the community. And then number 6 is talk about your organizational capacity. Who are the key individuals that are going to make this grant happen, that are going to make this program happen? And what about your organization should they know that will help ensure them that you're the best fit for this grant? And that's it. Like, it sounds really easy in theory. This is probably like one of the most basic grants that I've come across in a while. No, Chelsea, to answer your question, this is a program that your organization is actually doing already. I would suggest sticking to something that you covered in your case statement. Don't make up a new program to fund. I think that would be hard. And I would say, word to the wise, don't ask for capital support. Don't say you're building a building. Keep this programmatic or project focused. Question answered. Got it. Okay. Any other questions? Did I miss anybody? Annual funds. Should we do that? So, Katie, to answer your question, if your case statement was focused on your annual fund, basically, how does this relate? What I would suggest, what is probably easiest here, is to focus on a show or production or some sort of component or program for your organization. Asking for general operating support is much harder than asking for a program or programmatic support. Perfect. Okay. So I'm going to write myself a note right now to double check that I put assignment 3 in Word format. And if not, I'll do that tonight. Any other questions? Sweet. All right. Okay, Dimitri, you have a question? Or were you like swatting away flies?
In the chat that just popped up.
Oh, it's in the chat. Okay, great. Awesome. I want it. Sure, Alana, that is okay. You can take an existing program and sort of expand on it. And so she gives an example that her case statement was based around COVID, but they don't have an existing program right now regarding COVID. Yes, you absolutely, I find that relevant and that would be acceptable if you wish to do that. Who am I to say that program doesn't exist? I got 18 people. I don't have much time to do some research. Sometimes I go down rabbit holes and that's when you know I don't meet deadlines, but anywho. Okay, Brad.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so if you don't have any more questions, Sonia, stay on and we can look up your thing. So you can sleep tonight because you're probably like super worried. I would be. But if not, anyone have any other questions? If